Cold War Part 2. All right, so John Kennedy becomes president, taking office in 1961. He won the presidential election of 1960, you remember, against Richard Nixon. And this very young man, he is the youngest man ever to be elected president at the age of 43. He inherits the CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro's government. Remember that Eisenhower had authorized the CIA to begin planning for the removal of Castro. It was not yet finished when Eisenhower leaves office, and now it's in Kennedy's lap to decide what to do. So just after 3 months just 3 months after taking office, in April of 1961, Kennedy authorized the mission to begin. Now, what has happened is that the CIA had trained about 1,500 Cuban exiles, people who had escaped from Cuba and come to the United States for freedom. The CIA had trained about 1,500 Cuban exiles to fly into Cuba, to land at Cochinos Bay, literally translated to Bay of Pigs, on the southern side of the island of Cuba. You can see on the map. They would set up a base in the mountains. They would begin to broadcast by radio to the Cuban people, with the hopes that the people of Cuba would overthrow Castro and support these American-backed exiles to form a new government. Now, we're going to understand this was a total failure. The exiles, as they flew into the Bay of Pigs, were met with immediate resistance from the Cuban Air Force. Within just 3 days, 1,200 of the 1,500 were captured. This debacle at the Bay of Pigs reflected an American weakness to the world. Kennedy was seen as impulsive, inexperienced. At this point, the United States began a trade embargo against Cuba that lasted until 2016, and I believe in this latest administration has been reimposed. But Kennedy's reputation after this mission was in need of repair. Now, just 2 months, however, after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was scheduled to meet with the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at a summit meeting in Austria. And after meeting Kennedy, Khrushchev was convinced that this young president, again, inexperienced, young president, was kind of a lightweight, and that Kennedy's administration might represent a chance for the Soviet Union to kind of gain the upper hand in the Cold War. So after meeting Kennedy, Khrushchev decided to make a move in Germany. He ordered a wall be constructed around West Berlin in order to try to cut off all East Germans from getting to the democratic city of West Germany, thus, not being able to escape from East German communism. Now, short of war in Europe, there really wasn't a whole lot that Kennedy could do about this. But he had to do something, because if he did not act in some way, he would be seen as weak on communism. Now, in some ways, we can kind of think of the Cold War like a big old chess game. So one side makes a move and the other needs to counter that move in some way. So in response to the erection of the Berlin Wall in 1961, Kennedy is going to increase the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam. So Eisenhower had sent 2,000 military advisors back in the 50s, right? Kennedy increases that number to 16,000, right? So again, you can't fight him in Europe, and so we'll confront him in a sense in Southeast Asia. You'll up the number of American troops advising the South Vietnamese. So the Soviets act with the wall. Kennedy makes his move by upping the ante in Vietnam. Now Khrushchev is going to challenge Kennedy again in 1962 in the incident known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviet Union began installing nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba. Again, Cuba just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And actually, this was a response to an American action in Europe. Earlier in 62, the United States had installed nuclear-tipped missiles in Turkey, a NATO ally, pointed at the Soviet Union. Now, it was U-2 flights over Cuba that revealed the existence of these missiles pointed at the United States. And in October then of 1962, Kennedy is going to respond. He responded by ordering a naval blockade of Cuba to try to keep any more of those missiles from getting into Cuba from the Soviet Union. And he announced that the policy of the United States would be to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against anywhere in the Western Hemisphere to be an act of war. So for 10 days in October of 1962, the world was on edge as they watched these two nuclear-armed nations face off. The question was this: will the Soviets remove the missiles from Cuba as the Americans demand? Would the United States end the blockade of Cuba as the Soviets demanded? Or would there be war? Would one of these two nations use nuclear weaponry against the other? And there was no question that if there was war, it would be nuclear. Now, let me note that advisors on both sides, it's now known, advisors for Khrushchev, advisors for Kennedy, they were telling those leaders to use the weapons, to use nuclear weapons to deal with this conflict. And we should note that these two leaders were communicating by letter at this point in time. They were sending letters to each other's government by diplomatic courier. But ultimately, this crisis was resolved peacefully through negotiation and through compromise. On October the 28th, with an agreement by both sides, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end. The agreement was this: 1, the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. 2, in return, the United States would remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey. And 3, the United States pledged not to invade Cuba. The United States, in a sense, now agreeing that they would not try to remove Castro from power. Now, let us note that the American people really only knew about the first agreement. The American people were essentially told, hey, we won. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. It wasn't until many, many, many years later that they learned about the removal of the missiles in Turkey and the agreement to leave Castro alone. But let us note, both sides had made compromises at this point in time. Both sides had done everything they could to avoid a nuclear confrontation. Even though their own advisors were telling them to do it. And this is the closest that the world has ever come to nuclear war. As a result, then, both sides are going to take steps now to try to ratchet down the tensions between these two nations. And as you see from this editorial cartoon, you've got Kennedy, you've got Khrushchev. They're trying to hold the lid down on this monster of nuclear war. We got to get a lock for this thing. As a result, then, these two nations are going to take a couple of steps to try to, again, bring down the tension and increase the communications between the nations. First, we're going to see a communications hotline established to facilitate direct communications between the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States. Again, they've been writing letters to each other during this thing. What we're going to now see is the installation of a direct first teletype message system, and soon after a dedicated phone line, so that in the future these two leaders can instantly talk to one another to try to deal and settle with future problems and issues. And second, in 1963, these two nations will sign a nuclear test ban treaty, ban, B-A-N, a nuclear test ban treaty, in which they both agreed to no longer conduct above-ground testing of nuclear devices. This is the first treaty ever between these two nations dealing with nuclear weapons, and it represented a huge step forward. More treaties are going to follow in the coming decades that would deal with nuclear weaponry around the world. John Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, became president. Now, Lyndon Johnson will meet with Soviet leaders several times during his 5 years as president, but his administration is known primarily for Vietnam. Vietnam will be the biggest proxy war between the United States and communism. And Lyndon Johnson will be the president who sends those combat troops, American combat troops, into battle. Johnson turned up the heat in Vietnam in 1965. He had won his own term as president in 1964. And you may remember from, I think it was folder 15, the little video on his Great Society programs and war on poverty. In the 1964 election, Johnson had campaigned against the use of American combat troops in Vietnam. And remember, there were 16,000 American advisors in Vietnam at this point in time. But in 1965, excuse me, in 1965, when American ships were attacked by North Vietnam, in the region up here known as the Gulf of Tonkin. And American advisors were killed. Johnson began to escalate America's presence in Vietnam. Congress will authorize Johnson to handle Vietnam in any way he sees fit in a resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And Johnson now will begin a bombing campaign of North Vietnam. American planes now will bomb North Vietnam relentlessly throughout the rest of the American engagement in Vietnam. And soon after the bombing began, American combat troops began to arrive as well. And it was a really fast buildup. By the end of 1965, there were 184,000 American combat troops in Vietnam. And by the end of 1966, 385,000. By the end of 1969, at the height of American involvement in Vietnam, there were over 500,000 American combat troops now fighting the North Vietnamese. Over 542,000 to be specific, over 500,000 American combat troops. The United States troops will leave Vietnam in 1973 after 8 years of war. Over those 8 years, the United States dropped 1.5 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam, which is more bombs are measured in weight, which is more bombs than were used throughout the entire World War II. They called it carpet bombing in North Vietnam, kind of like a wall-to-wall carpet, bomb every inch of the place. And in addition, you're going to see 58,000 American dead in Vietnam and another 270,000 wounded. The biggest question that Americans had about Vietnam was why? Why was the United States fighting a war in Vietnam? Now, government leaders said that it was because of treaty obligations, that the United States had signed a treaty, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, a collective security agreement, right? That had pledged American support for nations in Southeast Asia, and of course the Truman Doctrine had said that the United States would support any free people resisting communism. But there's another reason. The other reason is something called the domino theory. The domino theory, right? You know, the policy of containment was to try to contain communism where it existed and not let it grow any further than it already had. And so the domino theory, in a sense, noted that China, had become communist in 1949. You had Korea in the early 50s that left North Korea communist, and that Vietnam was next. That if you let Vietnam fall to communism, they would argue that would just open the door for communism to grow throughout Asia. That if Vietnam fell, then next would be Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and Malaysia and all the way to India, where you just see the growth of communism throughout that region. So the United States was fighting then to keep the dominoes from falling, right? To keep Vietnam from going communist in hopes of preventing the neighboring nations from doing so as well. And you see some pictures on this slide from the war, from the battles, from the carnage. That was Vietnam. American strategy is to fight a war of attrition. In other words, to kill so many North Vietnamese troops and to inflict so much damage on North Vietnam through the bombing that North Vietnam could either not or would not wish to continue the fight. The thing is that Americans did not realize just how committed the North Vietnamese were to reunifying their country. For North Vietnam, this war wasn't about communism. This war was about independence, Vietnamese independence. The reunification of Vietnam as one nation, an independent nation. Throughout Vietnam's history, they'd been ruled by outsiders, the Chinese for centuries, the French beginning in the 19th century. They had won their independence from France. They wanted to be an independent nation. For them, it was about independence, about a Vietnam ruled by Vietnamese. And really, they saw this war as America's attempt to, in a sense, colonize Vietnam, to control Vietnam. They were pretty determined that not happen. In Vietnam, this war is known as the American War. The Vietnamese, I think, the North Vietnamese were willing to risk pretty much everything they had to try to achieve their independence, the reunification of their country. The United States was not willing to go that far. And I think the Vietnamese knew it and were willing, in a sense, to wait for America to reach its limits. Because the United States did have limits. They were not willing to carry out a massive, expanding war. The United States was not willing to fight a war that might have directly involved the Soviet Union, for example. That was the kind of war that could have gone nuclear. Would have been extremely costly. The United States wasn't willing to go that far. And the American people, they had their limits too. As the death toll increased month after month after month, as the American people saw images, film footage of the Vietnam War on television night after night on the news, as anti-war demonstrations began to be commonplace on campuses and in the streets of Washington. By the time Richard Nixon became president in 1969, the American people were simply no longer willing to allow this war to continue. Nixon ran for the presidency in '68 with a secret plan, he said, to end the war in Vietnam. But leaving the war really wasn't as easy as getting into it had been. The United States simply could not just withdraw all of their troops. They couldn't just walk away from the war. You have to maintain American credibility. They're in this to stop communism, right? They just can't walk away. The dominoes might fall. And so what had begun in 1965 as this righteous crusade to save Southeast Asia from communism ultimately ended up becoming a face-saving game for the United States to try to get out of Vietnam without looking too bad. And let me know, this was agonizing for Lyndon Johnson. He hated this. He agonized over this war. See the photos. He's exhausted. He's demoralized. Every month he realized he was sending more young men to die in Vietnam. But let me also note, he thought he was doing the right thing, because in that Cold War ethos, trying to stop the spread of communism seemed to be the right thing to do. Now, Lyndon Johnson could run again in 1968. He had served the last year of Kennedy's term. He'd won his own term in '64, and he was eligible to run again in 1968. But this war took a huge toll on Lyndon Johnson as he saw more and more money being allocated for the war in Vietnam rather than the war on poverty or the Great Society. And so in the spring of 1968, as the primaries began to nominate candidates for the election of 1968, with anti-war protesters outside the White House every day chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" In March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election in 1968. Richard Nixon will win the election of 1968, as we noted, taking office in 1969. He said he had a secret plan to bring Vietnam to an end, but it took another 4 years before American troops were finally withdrawn from Vietnam in 1973. And 2 years later, the North Vietnamese defeated the South Vietnamese. Vietnam was reunified under a communist government. The United States had failed. Nixon's Cold War achievements came in China and the Soviet Union. When Nixon became president in 1969, we should note that the United States still had not officially recognized the existence of the government of the People's Republic of China. The United States had never had not normalized trade with China. They had refused to send an ambassador or to establish an embassy in the People's Republic. For 20 years, in a sense, the United States had acted like one of the largest nations on the face of the earth, just didn't even exist. But in 1971, American officials began to explore the possibility of formally recognizing China and beginning normal diplomatic and trade relations. And so in 1972, Richard Nixon traveled to China. You see him here meeting with Mao Zedong. They agreed to begin exchanging scientific and cultural information and began to explore the resumption of trade between the two nations. They established cultural, not formal embassies, but presences in each other's country. And this was huge. This was a huge breakthrough. And it's important not just because it began to open or begin the process of normalizing the relationship between the United States and China, but also because it kind of upset the Soviet Union a bit. The Soviet Union was not especially happy about Nixon's overture to Mao. And even though most Americans, thought that all communists were the same, in reality, the Soviet Union did not get along very well with China. And they feared that perhaps the Chinese and the Americans might gang up on them. So the Soviets began to send out indications that they also wished to try to improve their relationship with the United States. And so just a couple of months after visiting China, still in 1972, Nixon went to Moscow. Nixon went to the Soviet Union, where he met with the then leader Leonid Brezhnev. This was the first time that an American president had visited the Soviet Union, and it initiated the beginning of a period known as détente. It's a French word, essentially meaning the easing of tensions. Nixon and Brezhnev agreed to more trade, to cooperate on some missions in space. They began to the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union began to get better. And détente is one of Nixon's lasting legacies, I think. Again, he's known basically for Watergate, you remember, but this is important. The Soviet Union and the United States agreed to some new arms control treaties, strategic arms limitations treaties, SALT, strategic arms limitation treaties. Treaties that began to that helped these two nations begin to get serious about trying to bring down the number of nuclear weapons that these nations had warehoused, ready to be used. And so when Nixon resigned from the presidency in August of 1974, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was at a high point. It was the best it had been since the end of World War II. So next time in part 3, we'll take a look at Jimmy Carter and the Soviet Union and bring this Cold War to an end as well.